Good night again, everyone. So before I begin, I would like to acknowledge our distinguished guests who are joining us this evening. So we have Dr. Haynes, who's the head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies, Nitabara Unit. Our featured author for this evening, Miss Lyvonne Briggs, author of Sensual Faith, The Art of Coming Into Your Body. Our moderator this evening will be Miss Alicia Haynes. Deans, heads of department, students, members of the campus community, members of the media, specially invited guests, all, welcome. So on behalf of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies of the University of the West Indies, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's Verandah chat and book signing, featuring, once again, our author, Lyvonne Briggs, and her book, Sensual Faith, The Art of Coming Into Your Body. At this time, I would like to invite the head, Dr. Tonya Haynes, to give opening remarks.
Thanks for that. I appreciate the applause. Chair, Ms. Saresa Springer-Barnett, PhD student at the Nitabara Unit and organizer of our seminar series, of which tonight's event is a part. Dina Combo, Dean of the Faculty of Culture, Creative and Performing Arts. Our moderator for this evening, Ms. Alicia Haynes, heads of department, students, members of the campus committee, specially invited guests, our featured author this evening as well, Ms. Lyvonne Briggs. It is a pleasure to welcome you to this evening's conversation during Women's History Month and on the heels of International Women's Day. The UN Women theme for this year's International Women's Day is Rights, Justice, Action for all women and girls. UN Women reminds us that globally, many women and girls are living without full legal protection. 44% of countries lack consent-based definitions of rape, and 54% of countries, and 44% of countries do not have laws that guarantee equal pay for equal work. Where the prevalence data for the region in the Caribbean exists, lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence is 55% in Guyana, 48% in Suriname, 44% in Trinidad and Tobago, 39% in both Grenada and Jamaica, and Barbados's own data puts it at about 30%. And all of these countries exceed the global average of 1 in 3 women likely to experience intimate partner violence in her lifetime. Rights, justice, and action are also central to the work of the Institute for Gender and Development Studies, Nitabara Unit, where our PhD students are researching state actions and inactions to address gender-based violence in Antigua and Barbuda, as well as interrogating criminal justice responses to sexual and gendered violence in Barbados. And that particular one is the research being done by Saresa Springer-Barnett. Tonight's event extends that work of centering the lives of Caribbean women and girls. Author, preacher, speaker, coach, and creator, body and sex positive womanist and Emmy Award winner, Lyvonne Briggs, will lead us on a wide-ranging conversation on sexuality and spirituality. Reading her book, Sensual Faith, made me recall my own PhD work looking at the knowledge economy of gender. And it brought me back to interviewing Caribbean feminist scholars about the place of sexuality in their work. And I recall one of the things that Professor Mohammed said to me about the place of sexuality in her own research on, for her book that was about the reconstruction of patriarchy among Indo-Caribbean communities. And one of the things that she said, and I quote, was, "I can't remember any of us actually confronting the issues of sex and sexuality head on. I think we dealt with what we saw as gender issues. It wasn't that we weren't aware of it. In a sense, I think we recognized that the question of control of female sexuality was at the root of what was troubling for us. But maybe we framed it differently, and I think we didn't have the language to address it. If I think of all the papers I wrote, why is it that I didn't sit down and write a paper that confronts sexuality so much? And I've talked about this. why it took us so long to write about this and to see it as important to us. As we examine how spirituality and sexuality are imbricated in rights, justice, and action for all women and girls, either as a source of strength and empowerment or oppression and disadvantage, I encourage you to take an active part in the conversation. Sarasa has put together a very wonderful, intimate space for you this evening. So I welcome you to tonight's event. I hope you will be intrigued, provoked, inspired to action by this evening's proceedings. Welcome and thank you, and special welcome to Lyvonne.
Without further delay, I invite our moderator, Ms. Alicia Haynes, and our featured author, Ms. Lyvonne Briggs.
All right, so good night, everyone. My name is Alicia Haynes, and I'm a lecturer at the Institute for Gender and Development Studies. I'm also a PhD student who is studying women's digital lives. And this evening we have Lyvonne Briggs with us. And Lyvonne, I just want to welcome you to the Verandah.
Thank you.
Yes, so
I'm so happy to be here. What's going on?
What's going on? And I love this. I love the concept and the symbolism of the Verandah, because Michaela Severa, in her ethnography on gender non-conforming identities in Jamaica and her dissidence with, the religious ideologies, she talks about this big veranda as a discursive space for the production of knowledge and counter discourse in Caribbean societies. Mm-hmm. So I just really want to think through the ways in which women, reflect on their experiences through that big veranda. And I want to welcome you and introduce you to everyone as a pastor, the author of this amazing and brilliant text, Sensual Faith, and welcome you into the space as we co-create knowledge in our veranda.
Thank you so much for having me. It is truly an honor to be here. And as I am a daughter of the diaspora, I descend from Sierra Leone on my mom's side, Angola on my dad's side. My dad was born in Guyana. My mom was born here in Bridgetown. And so I sit at the intersection of America, the United States specifically, of the Caribbean. And so the veranda sounds a lot like the porch of the global American South. And so it's just beautiful to see these concepts thread throughout the diaspora. So no matter where you are, as long as you're African descended, there is some seat for you that is available for conversation and for community, which is a currency in this era.
Most definitely. So first, I want to say thank you for creating such a brilliant and generous space through this work, Sensual Faith. And it helps us to think through the various intersections of Black women's identities, particularly in terms of how they navigate their faith journeys and their embodied selves. So I entered this conversation thinking with Jackie Alexander, who asks, whether Caribbean feminist projects have sometimes split the erotic, that is like the sexual, perhaps the sensual, from this theorizing of gender, while privatizing the spiritual as, a personal and intimate construct away from feminist politics. So I think that your book, Sensual Faith, is an intervening space that joins these two concepts together. And as a former literature student, I couldn't help but smile when I saw the title, Sensual Faith, because, when we think about religious ideologies, they're always juxtaposed as oppositional. So I love it. So your work brings these concepts, sensuality and faith, into conversation. So thinking about the title of your work, how do you think about sensuality as a pastor, as an author, and through this work?
Thank you so much for bringing Jackie Alexander's name up. I believe that faith has been co-opted by very conservative, evangelical, often white folk. And studies show that Black women are the most religious demographic in the world. We're also the most educated. We have the highest number of advanced degrees. And we're also the fastest growing number of entrepreneurship. And I know when I'm talking about Black women, I cannot not talk to the church because we're so religiosized, right? When I thought about sensual faith, I thought about sensuality as a womanist spiritual practice. So when you look in the dictionary, sensuality is often defined as lewdness or lasciviousness, But sensuality and sexuality are not the same things. They inform each other, but they're different. And so when I think about sensuality, I think about, not to be ableist, but if you have functioning faculties, you can see, you can touch, you can taste, you can hear, right? Sensuality is simply being mindful of what you're experiencing through your senses. And that is a pretty universal human experience. And so I often wondered why sensuality and sexuality were being conflated when they actually offer very rich conversations and tones, particularly for Black women. And so sensual faith is a theological, socio-political, cultural, ethical framework that centers the experiences of Black women. Feminism was not created for us, and I do respect its role in scholarship, in resistance, in protest. Also, in 1979, author Alice Walker coined a term called womanist. And in 1983, in Search of Our Mother's Gardens, she puts out this 4-part definition of what a womanist is. And my favorite to introduce the concept of womanism to folks is number 4, which says, womanism is to feminism as purple is to lavender. Womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender, which means we're in the same color family. But come on in, y'all. Come on. We got plenty of room on the veranda. But what we experience as Black women, it's a deeper, richer, nuanced experience that we have. And so that's why sensuality as a womanist spiritual practice centers the experiences, vantage points, and perspectives of Black women. And as a first generation Afro-Caribbean American woman, I'm speaking from my personal experience. And so that's why all of this tied together into sensual faith.
Okay. I love that in terms of those ideas, the colonial constructions of Black womanhood. So I'm going to ask you, in terms of your own perspectives, how do you classify the category of woman, and how do you conceptualize Black womanhood through your work?
So I believe womanhood is an expression of what we would call divine feminine energy. I believe that no matter how you come to your womanhood, you have the agency and self-actualization to show up in your womanhood. I also believe when we're talking about energy as a spiritualist, that it's not just women who hold feminine energy. I believe men, non-gender conforming folks, non-binary folks, trans folks, everyone has a part of it, right? It's just some of us may have a little more, a heftier scoop than others. And so for me, it's coming up as a cisgender, heterosexual girl into a woman, and that thread that has just come through my life. And so it shows up in the ways that I've been socialized. It shows up in the ways that I feel most at home in my body. And it comes up in the way that not only how I present myself to the world, but how then people reflect me back to me through their projections, right? And that also talks about how I show up as a woman in our modern culture.
All right, so I guess when I think about this category of women, I think about the ways in which, Black women were not even able to occupy the category, right? Because of the ways we've been dehumanized. But in your work, you talk about this concept of, coming home to the body. And this metaphor resonates in terms of religious rhetoric that often describes the body as a temple of God. And this same rhetoric has historically been used to police women's sexuality and prescribe what is appropriate and those right modes of behavior for women as they navigate public spaces, right? So in your book, you also reflect on Black womanhood, these cultural expectations that shape how Black women are perceived and how they're taught to inhabit their bodies within these histories that have often pathologized, hypersexualized, and dehumanized them. So I'm also thinking about Harriet Spillers, who, she reminds us that the body carries so much trauma, metaphorically and literally, that in many ways our body remembers.
Yes.
So what does it mean for Black women to come home, that languaging of coming home to their bodies in your work, in the wake of these histories, and how does sensual faith imagine these processes of, returning to yourself, healing, and reflection?
That's beautiful. So when we think about religion, we can't divorce it from colonization. And in my book, I talk about how colonization is an act on the body and the land, and colonialism is an act on the mind. And so as Black women, we are daughters of African descended people. And so we have to think about not just chattel slavery, because that's not the beginning of our history, but who we were on the continent before the colonizers ever came. And so in the same way that Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about epigenetics and how trauma can be passed down, if trauma can be passed down, then healing can be passed down as well. And so in the book, The Body Keeps the Score, it talks about how trauma can be stored in our bodies. If you study children and their exposure to trauma, we learn about ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And so it's not just what's happening to us on an individual level from the time that we're born up until now. It's also what did our mother go through, because that affects our mothering. What did our father go through? That affects our being fathered. What did our grandparents go through? Because for women, we were a tiny little egg in our mother's body while our mother was gestating in our grandmother. And so there are these threads through our lineages that aren't just person to person, generation to generation, but also collective to collective. So when we're thinking about the things that we've inherited, when we're talking about chattel slavery, when we think about how our foremothers were not able to rest, when we think about the brutalization of Black women's bodies, when we think about Dolores Williams in Sisters of the Wilderness, she talks about how Black women's bodies were sites of hyperproductivity, particularly through forced reproduction. When your ancestors were the currency, what does that mean for you in a capitalist society today? And so as Black women, when we rest, that is a revolution. When Black women take a nap, that is resistance. And so it's important for us to honor that while our foremothers were not afforded the opportunities to stand in their agency, we are called to live an embodied liberative ethic that honors the rest that they deserve, that they did not get, that honors the money that they are owed with tax plus interest. When we talk about bodies being the site of torment and trauma, that means every time you care for your body, whether it's intuitive eating, nourishing yourself with whole foods, when you move your body in a way that feels good to you, not at the direction of an enslaver, not because if you don't move or if you don't have this much sugar cane picked or you don't have this much cotton, in the global South and the States picked, that you're gonna be tormented. That agency is in and of itself liberative. So I honor where we are as a collective, and I also know that what we are experiencing as Black women, it's not just us. It's not just what we experience as girls, it's what our generations before us experienced as well. And that's why in my belief system, when you care for yourself, we believe that you're healing 7 generations before you and 7 generations coming after you. So in the words of our beloved Bayesian ancestor, Audre Lorde, right, caring for myself is not self-indulgent, it's self-preservation. And self-preservation is an act of political warfare.
Yeah, I think that that's really important politically. And I think in our conversation, even before this session, we were just thinking through the tangible ways in which we take care of ourselves. Mm-hmm. We were talking about going to the beach, hanging with friends, going to buy food, things like that nourish our souls. And I think that is really important for feminist spaces in particular, to think through the ways in which we have to care for ourselves as we continue to bear the brunt for other women, as we language their stories and their experiences and make it audible and visible to the world.
Right. Yeah. Sensual Faith came about because right around 2017, which was the rise of the Me Too movement in the States, I was talking about gender-based violence. Excuse me. I was talking about gender-based violence online. And every day for a year, I was talking about statistics, which we don't need to name because we know the stories, right? I was talking about stories, I was talking about trauma, and I was just so tired and burnt out after a year that I realized, you know what? If I talk about trauma, we're gonna heal. If I talk about pleasure, we're gonna heal. And I know which one I enjoy talking about more, because you can only receive as much pleasure as you have received healing. So if we're talking about pleasure and something comes up in you, it's like, okay, let's address that speed bump, right? But we don't have to constantly revisit the site of the accident, right? The site of the wound and the cut and the laceration to talk about it. We can live our lives as full, as autonomous Black folks, and whenever we get that bit of resistance, we meet the resistance with grace and we interrogate that, and that is going to help us to unpack the trauma. But to just talk about trauma day in and day out, child, we are tired.
I agree. But I want to spend a bit more time talking about the trauma first before we move on to like thinking about the digital and liberatory spaces for women. So your work, I categorize it as part of a literary tradition of, Caribbean women writing about their experiences. And I find that your work in particular resonates for me with these explorations of respectability politics and, this body policing. For example, I'm thinking about Sherry Jules and her work. It's a short story called Child of a Lesser God. And she foregrounds this character is Josie, who observes the architecture of, social relationships around her while she's simultaneously being watched, right? So it would start with like, see Josie watch the men, see Josie watch the women. So she's observing, but she's also being observed at the same time, and judged through this respectability politics. Ultimately, she suffered at the hands of her mother, who, when she steps out of these social expectations, burned out the house with Josie inside, right? So I just want to think through what this trauma means for women, as they're constantly held to these social expectations of being pious, having piety, being very mindful and very demure, as the young people would say on social media. Haven't seen it trending recently, So just thinking about how our bodies, women's bodies, become sites of morality, this respectability politics and communal authority, where it's reinforced in our bodies through discipline. So how do you navigate it? Because you speak to authors like Toni Morrison or New Hurston. You talk about Audre Lorde a lot in your work. You also refer to like other artists like Lauryn Hill and Rhapsody, in terms of being a part of a cultural tradition that languages and affirms Black womanhood away from trauma. So could you elaborate more on that?
Absolutely. So I love that you brought up fiction, because in that excerpt, the language mirrors that of sort of like a primary school age or even earlier, where it's like see, spot, run, right? You're trying to get a young mind to focus on a subject and verb agreement and just to get the clarity out. And for many Black girls, we don't often have many years where we get to have that kind of elementary, rudimentary experience. Georgetown Law School performed a study, and they found that Black girls as young as 5 years old are adultified, and they're seen as not as worthy of protection or care as their white counterparts. 5 years old. Think about your 5-year-old niece or nephew or nibbling. Think about your 5-year-old neighbor, and think about how precious and young and innocent they are, right? And then think about a matrix of systems of oppression that were constructed to annihilate this precious soul. That is what Black girlhood has been in the colonized West. And so when we are able to reject all of the conditioning that came from former slave owners and enslavers, when you think about how a young girl cannot be fast, when you think about how a child cannot entice a grown man sexually, when you remove any sort of perverted, thwarted, toxic ideology masquerading as theology that says that a child can entice a grown person, then you're forced to sit with, well, how do we accept that there are people in our community who have harmed our children? It's not our children's fault. So now we're putting the onus back where it belongs. And that is a call for accountability. It's very easy for us to talk about big name celebrities or politicians or the Epstein files, and we want to see all this go down, but keep the same energy for the pastors, the preachers, the teachers, the coaches, right? Your homie, your friend, your boy. We have to have that thread of accountability throughout the entire community in order to protect Black girls, and I would say Black boys, Black children. And so needless to say, when we do start from a place of protection and preservation, that very much mirrors what I call the sanctuary, the continent of Africa before the colonizers came. It mirrors the sanctuary where we were a matrilineal society that was deeply steeped in community and nature, that saw every person in the community as a valuable person who belonged to the tribe, to the kin, and they had an important role. And so coming up, my mom was taught children are to be seen and not heard. And so when she had me and my brother, she went way left. And now I run my mouth for a living. So you can see how breaking generational curses and creating new generational patterns works. So protecting Black girls, Black children is so important. Holding adults who are harmful in the community accountable is important, and reclaiming who we were on the continent of Africa is so important.
Okay. So following from that, so do you give us a bit more history in terms of your journey? Because you started as Anglican, you're a pastor. And I love that you talked about, women and how girls have been seen in churches. And I can give my own experience growing up as an Adventist and some of the messaging that I heard. I wasn't a normal Adventist that would only go to Adventist church, turn off the TV at 6 p.m. and not watch it till 6 p.m. on a Saturday. But I do remember a lot of harmful messages around women, like girls having to shut their legs. It's at one point, because a lot of girls were getting pregnant in their teenage years, and what would happen for me was a form of violence in terms of how they would be read out to church. But yet still the person that impregnated them would still be allowed to go on the rostrum to preach, to leave Sabbath school. So there were no punishments for men, but women were excluded and shamed and then isolated from their own communities because, the whole idea of pregnancy out of wedlock brought embarrassment. I also remember going to other churches because, being a liberal Adventist, I also used to visit other churches and, be a part of their youth groups as well. And I remember this one was at a particular Pentecostal church. And the conversation was around women's bodies. And they were talking about, if women have their bosoms exposed, imagine the pastor's looking down and you're misleading him, right? So all of these harmful messages around women's bodies. I remember another woman, she was talking about, they were encouraging, young people not to have sex, premarital sex. And she was like, oh Lord, from the time you hold his hand, you're pregnant. Like, please be for real. Please be for real. So it's like, these things are framed around women's bodies. And it encourages a sense of self-loathing, distancing, a lack of understanding, and these expectations that suddenly when they get into relationships or marriage, because they're talking about the context of the church, that suddenly, they're supposed to know. So could you, share a bit more about your journey and the ways in which, maybe women can kind of rediscover themselves as a result?
Certainly. So yes, I was born and raised in the Episcopal Church, St. James the Less Episcopal Church in Queens, New York. I served as an acolyte, and so from a very young age, I had a great respect for liturgy, right? We had frankincense and myrrh and incense and candles and bells, and it was a performance, okay? It was high tea. And then when I was 19, we had a revival at this church. And it was the first time that I felt moved to tears, which, in an Episcopal church, it's very stoic. It's very sit, stand, kneel,
page 355, Book of Common Prayer, right? You don't veer from that. And it was in that moment that I knew there's something more to this God thing, to this religion thing, than just what I've been conditioned to believe. And so when I was in college, I joined a Pentecostal church. So in the Anglican church, we didn't talk about bodies much, but I was a 7-year-old black girl kneeling on an altar underneath a white man with blue eyes and brown hair, right? Which the historical Christ figure was not white. He was a North African Jewish refugee who was a revolutionary, right? Not a white man, not blonde hair, blue eyes. That's not going to fly on the continent of Africa. And so when I got to the Pentecostal church, that was where I saw movement in the church, right? There's clapping of hands, stomping of feet, dancing, swaying, shouting, swinging from the chandeliers, I like to say. And I thought it was so interesting. I was like, we can do all of these acrobatics and utilize our bodies for the expression of the worship of God. But when it comes to accessing our bodies for our own pleasure, all of a sudden, hold on, be holy for I am holy. And I started having questions because, again, as a black girl who did experience bodily harm, I was like, I don't think that you telling me that a demon harmed me is really going to help me heal when I know it was this person, right? It was a human being. And so that was when I started to experience cognitive dissonance, because I'm like, I know I am worthy of a theology that sees everything that I've been through and that sees all of me as a black woman. So then when I was in seminary, I graduated with a Master of Divinity from Yale Divinity School. And while I was there, I started going to Baptist churches because they were into social justice and they listened to R&B and hip hop. And I was like, I need to be around people who I could listen to regular music, not just gospel all the time. And so to be a Episcopal, right, means that just like God is transcendent, I have transcended these labels and these dogmas and these rituals to get to a place where I'm like, okay, this was the religion of my childhood. Now, how do I embrace the faith of my womanhood that embraces all of me? So going to seminary was a major shift for me because it wasn't Sunday school and it wasn't Bible study. It was the esoteric study of religion. I went to school with people who were Christians, who were studying to be pastors. I went to school with atheists. I went to school with seekers. I went to school with Buddhists. Like, I went to school with people who weren't interested in the church, but they knew if they were studying economy, history, political science, that you can't do that and not study religion. And so that's why it's important to talk about religion versus faith versus spirituality, right? Because religion is from the Latin legare, which means to fasten or to bind. And we know means to repeat something, to do an action again. And so your religion should rebind you to your creator. It should refasten you to God. But religion has been co-opted and colonized in the West. And so it's a system of rules and regulations steeped in dogma that are constricting and restrictive rather than expansive. So then faith is what you say you believe, right? You believe Black people are worthy of liberation. How do you show that every single day? You believe Black children are worthy of protection. How do you show that every single day? Because how you show up every single day, that is your spirituality. Because if you look in the word spirituality, it's the word ritual. A ritual is anything that you put your spiritual intention into and show up with. So now it's not just about taking communion on Sundays. It's how are you showing up every day in the expansive, loving, social justice oriented, compassionate, right, space that the Creator has for you. So all that to say that if you have ever thought to yourself, there's got to be more to it than this, that is the hunch. Because when it comes to our bodies, we know what it's like when we hear that beat drop, when we riding behind a big truck, okay, when we jab, and we whining and wucking up. That's not new. Whining, wucking up, in the States we have twerking, throwing, bouncing. Our foremothers, certain tribes would bare their breasts at the sun. They would shake their buttocks in worship while others played music and drummed and they would dance. And so it's only through the lens of the brutes known as the English colonizers, right, who were seeking religious refuge from their own motherland, right, coming here and superimposing their very prudent, puritanical, can't even call them ideals, but insufficient, incomplete thoughts, right, and projecting that onto our bodies and our customs. And so what I'm calling us to do is to decolonize our religion, which for many Black people is Christianity. I'm calling us to reclaim our African spiritual base and practices. I'm calling Black women in particular, even though this does, transcend race and gender and class, but Black women to heal our bodily trauma and to learn to love ourselves unapologetically. And so that's a bit of my journey, how I got here, and where I hope we can go.
Okay, so that's really beautiful. And I'm thinking about your mentioning of the puritanical views and ideologies. And I just want to take it to the context of the US in terms of what we are witnessing with this renewed conservatism globally, where the social reproductive rights and trans rights are being rolled back. So where do you position your book politically in terms of the discursive, in terms of the political framing, in terms of the faith-based, narratives? Where do you position your book politically given what is happening in the global landscape?
So there's a white Christian man on Goodreads who left my book a 1-star review and said that I was leading people away from Jesus. So that should tell you where I land politically. We don't, but the point is, as a Black woman centering the experiences, perspectives, and vantage points of Black women, I am well aware that what liberates Black women is going to liberate everybody else. And so when we look to the most marginalized among us, and that would be a young, poor, queer, disabled Black girl, right? If we can get her, if we can get Keisha Ann in the wheelchair free, everybody and their mama are gonna be free. And so I am pro-choice, I am pro-consent, I am pro-kink. There are so many things that are existing and orbiting the conversation of sex and sexuality beyond sexual intercourse between a man and a woman. When we're talking about our politic and our ethic, when I'm talking about pleasure, I include sexual pleasure, but I don't mean solely sexual pleasure. I have met women who have been married for 20 years, have birthed 3 children, and have never experienced an orgasm, right? That is saying something about a culture. That is saying something about women's pleasure specifically, because sex is often seen as a vehicle for men's pleasure. It's something that, we're talking about straight folks now, that women are supposed to provide for men. Whereas, we grown in here. Women are the only creatures in all of creation to have a clitoris. A clitoris does not birth babies, it doesn't urinate, it doesn't defecate, it doesn't cook, it doesn't clean. It has one job, and that is pleasure. So that tells me that if we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, and all of us is created in the divine's image, that does not mean just our hands to clap along to the hymn. That does not mean just our lips to pray a psalm. It also means our vulva. It also means our uterus. It also means our breasts, our hip dips, our stretch marks. All of that is holy too. And so saying that the body, especially Black women's bodies, are holy just as they are is revolutionary. Embodiment. Not just thinking up, we're in the academy and everyone's pursuing their degrees and, we love to think and read, but I challenge and invite us to think about how am I experiencing life from the neck down? If I turn off, what's the syllabus? What book can I read? What do you feel right now? Trusting your intuition is a spiritual gift. Some people call it the Holy Spirit, some people call it their ancestors. But women have this innate giftedness, this sixth sense, some people call it, and we're taught not to trust that. But the fact of the matter is that a woman who trusts her intuition cannot be controlled. And religion has been a tool of the oppressor for far too long. Because if I can control what you think about your God, I can control how you show up for that God. And if I control that, I can control how you think. And if I control how you think, I can control your body. And that is what people want. The matrix of systems of oppression wants to control Black people's bodies. It's what they've done as colonizers and enslavers for millennia. So every time you remove yourself from that system of oppression, that is protest. Every time you withdraw your energy from systems that just want to siphon it, that is our ancestors' wildest dreams, right? So all that to say that knowing your body, honoring your body, embracing your body is good, and it is God. And that's not what you're gonna hear Sunday morning at St. James Lesk Episcopal Church.
Thanks for that. But you're talking about it in terms of protests. I just have a question about, decolonization, because you speak about it in terms of liberating ourselves. So what do you mean about the difference between the colonial practice and liberating ourselves as women, especially as I think about how many feminists write and many literary authors write, to resist the, dominant constructive narrative around women's bodies and identities and things like that. But in my own research, I just feel like, I'm exploring much more like the ways in which women just exist. Whether or not I see it as political, sometimes, women say, well, I just want to be online and be everybody's best friend. So their existence is just existing without, the entourage of these colonial histories. They just want to live, all right? So just thinking about, that framing of protest, that framing of a decolonial practice versus liberating ourselves.
Beautiful question. So one of my contemporaries, Ebony Janice Moore, she wrote a book called All the Black Girls Are Activists, where basically whether you show up to a protest or not as a Black woman, you are an activist because of your embodiment in this, I like to say, the illusion of white supremacy, child, because ain't nothing supreme about whiteness. Whiteness is fake, it's made up, race is not real, it's a social construct, all of that. Anywho, point is, in this matrix of systems of oppression with the illusion of white supremacy, patriarchy, misogyny, misogynoir, homophobia, queerphobia, transphobia, ageism, ableist, all the things, all the isms and schisms, right? When you show up as a Black woman, you are an affront to that. The system wants you to hate yourself. And every time you hate yourself, you do the work of the oppressor for them. And so that's why it's so important for me to let Black people know that your divine code, your imprint, is holy and good and sacred from the beginning. All of this tomfoolery about Blackness being equated with sin, that comes from ancient Greco-Roman thoughts and ideologies that were more about darkness of feeling, of spirit, of sin, not skin tone, right? And so for me, it's important to honor that language is important, right? As a writer, as an author, as a poet, as a preacher, I use language to communicate with people. And so I was in Atlanta, Georgia with a colleague. Her name is Dr. Crystal Jones. She's a disruptor, a healer, the founder of the Alter Call. Alter is spelled A-L-T-E-R. And so we're sitting there drinking tea, and she said, your cells hear everything you say. Your cells hear everything you say. This is why positive words of affirmation are so important. And what we were talking about was when you say decolonize, you're still centering colonization. But when you say liberate, you're focusing on what's possible and not what is and what has been. And so that's why I adopted that language, yeah. So I say decolonize for all intents and purposes because many people know that word, but it's only gonna happen once or twice. Liberate says the same exact thing and places the emphasis on what we want to see. Adrienne Marie Brown, in her book Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, she said, all organizing is science fiction, right? Because we have not yet seen a world where Black girls and women and femmes are free and safe and soft, which is my definition of liberation. And so we're constantly imagining, we're constantly envisioning, we're constantly visualizing, we're playing and we're jumping double dutch and we're going out to brunch and we're doing our makeup, and all of these rituals, right, are conjuring a new world where we are not bound by this matrix of systems of oppression, but we are liberated to live in our bodily autonomy, to show up in the fullness of who we are, to express ourselves, to reclaim our spirituality, to embrace our sensuality, to express our sexuality, right? That is not the end game, but it's my hope. That is my hope and my intention for us. So did that answer your question?
Yes, but I still have another one to that,
Okay.
because it's like, okay, we can live in our embodied selves as women, but I still feel like sometimes we are limited by the structures that are in place. And I'm here thinking about my research on Caribbean women's digital lives, and I'm thinking about two artists in particular who turn up like in swimsuits. One would be pole dancing while she's painting, and she will post to her stories. Another one would be just doing commission work, and she's painting in whatever she feels like wearing. And then when you see the comments, it's a whole set of trolls who will be telling them, you know, that they should put on clothes, or, you know, the algorithm will shadow ban them, or there will be like this content moderation where, you know, they would have to always be accountable to their audiences, you know, because, you know, of these perceptions. Right. So yes, it's liberation, but how can we kind of normalize it across public spaces? So language in, you know, the ways in which we want to express ourselves through writing is important, through cultural discourse is important, but we still have to exist. So how do we kind of navigate these spaces?
So I'm a rebel and a disruptor. You know, I believe that women are extremely powerful. And I know that when I talk to Black women in particular, and we get free from colonized religion and internalized misogyny, and we decenter men and the idea that a married, romantic, heterosexual, typically, relationship with a man is the highest point of access for us, that's when we will truly be free. So when it comes to the online world, you're absolutely right. A thin, pale body can wear a swimsuit and do a TikTok dance and get 1 million views, whereas that same swimsuit on a curvy brown body gets shadow banned and all sorts of trolls come out. This goes to the thinking that I want to eradicate. Have you ever heard someone say, you know, I could be harmed because of the color of my skin? I can be prejudiced against because of the color of my skin. Baby, it's never the color of your skin. It's because of the bigotry. It's because of the ingrained hatred in that other person. Your skin is not the problem. Your skin is magnificent, right? And so what I want to do is empower people to know that you can leave any space that is not amplifying your magic. And when I'm talking to Black women, I know that I'm talking about the Black church, because the Black church is at least 85% Black women. Every Black church congregation, if you drive to 12 churches on Sunday morning, you will see 85 to 15 women to men inside of that church. And so if Black women are making up Black churches, that means Black women's dollars are making up Black churches' tithes and offerings. And while we like to think there's the separation of church and state, I didn't come to preach, but since I'm here, money talks in a capitalist society. And I know capitalism is not sustainable, but as long as there's a stock market and people are making money from a stock market, I want us to be making money from the stock market. Hello. So I say that to say that it comes down to Black women being empowered to know that you do not have to follow the voice of a man, singular man, nay, your pastor, and that you know God for yourself, There are so many books that you can be reading that have a liberative lens, that come from a Black feminist place, that come from a womanist place, that empower you and guide you towards your liberation, as opposed to just putting you on this, belt of conformity. And so I say that to say, put your money where your liberation is. I teach my community that tithing does not have to go to a church, because when we were quarantined and we couldn't get to the church, the artists were encouraging us. The poets were writing for us. The people playing saxophones, the dancers, right? Thank you. The artists, look, the book is in agreement too. The artists were the ones who were helping us get through this very dark time. Okay, it wasn't the preachers going door to door. That's not what helped our spirits. And so you can tithe to any organization that is feeding you. You can tithe to an artist, a poet. You can tithe to a dancer. You can tithe to a professor, a teacher, okay? Like, you have options. And that's the beauty of living in this fourth wave of womanism, is that artists are sacred texts now. Right? That's why I talked about Lauryn Hill. That's why I talked about Rhapsody. It's why I would talk about an Alicia Haynes. It's why I would talk about a Lady Saw, because there are no first-person narrative. Well, this isn't entirely true, but there aren't any first-person narratives of children in the Bible. We have some first-person narratives of women. They've just been co-opted and mislabeled as men's versions of the story. But even when you look in Song of Solomon, when the speaker is talking about, my breasts are like mounds, it's not a brother talking, right? Men have breasts, but they often aren't. They can be. They often aren't mounds. And so the point is that you have to look to different sacred texts to make yourself whole and to see yourself in it.
Okay. And I think based on what you're saying too, finding space or finding community is important.
Absolutely.
And Lyvonne, we are in the veranda, and we have other people here, joining us in community. So I now want to turn over the conversation to them to see if they want to ask you some questions from the veranda.
Absolutely.
So we now open the floor to you. Any questions to Lyvonne?
So thank you. That was very, very insightful. So I am a Christian woman who was raised in a Pentecostal church with a female bishop, my grandmother, running the church. So I have naturally got a different lens because I haven't come up with that kind of colonial view of what church and God is, what Christ is. I've come up understanding the freedom of Christ. How important do you think it is when we speak about colonization, Africa, Christianity, Christ specifically, for people across the diaspora to read into the history of Christianity, to connect it back to the origins of where things like the Bible came from? Because I've lived in Barbados now for just under a year, guys. Welcome me back. And I've had a lot of conversations that speak about, Christianity is from the West. And I'm like, well, actually, the first Bible is Ethiopian, and that is not in the West.
Correct.
So for the full circle of Black women coming back to ourselves and understanding that journey, how do we start to express from a historical standpoint, where do we research to really reconnect and understand that this thing is also ours? As they dig up the architecture and confirm everything that we said is ours is ours, how do we keep that connection without getting a bit, big-headed in the space, if that makes sense? Like, how do we bring that balance back of what we've known? Because this is such a loaded question, I'm sorry. You mentioned about us being in spaces, right? And like, feeling Holy Spirit and Black women being like 85% of the church. But what if that is the spiritual calling to say, remain where you know you're meant to be?
That is very intriguing. So I know that there are some Black women who love the Black church down. Born in the Black church, gonna die in the Black church. Don't talk about my pastor, right? Cool. There are some women who have never been inside of a church, have no interest in being in a church. I'm not trying to get you to church. But there's, in social entrepreneurship, we call this the movable middle, where the twos and the threes, the folks who have questions and are just curious, right? And so it's never my intention to tell Black women to leave the church or Christianity. I'm a preacher who doesn't go to church. And that's just because I've experienced way too much sexism and internalized misogyny. I'm just not interested. I would never tell anyone how to live their life, right? That's simply another form of domination and control. And Bell Hooks and All About Love taught us that abuse and love can't coexist. Domination and love cannot coexist. So I would never try to do that. What I will say is pay attention to who's teaching you and why, right? The Bible was written at a particular time by particular men with a particular agenda. And over time, it has been picked over, there have been councils, they have put these canons together to present a story that they want told, right? And so I am not telling Black women not to interrogate. I'm encouraging Black women to interrogate their faith, right? I want you to use the good sense that God gave you, because you can be a person of faith and intellect. Being a person of faith doesn't mean that you accept everything that's presented to you, and being a person of intellect doesn't mean that you can't always not know everything, right? Two truths can be true at the same time. And so the last thing that I'll say is, there's a queer theologian, her name is Zan West, and a question that she always poses is, who does it serve for you to believe it this way? So if you're believing something in a particular way, is it serving you? And if it's not, who is it serving? And if it's not serving you, how can you create, develop, expand your understanding of theology, ethics, morals, so that you can create something that feels good to you? So at the end of the day, I'm not on a mission to tell people to leave the church. I'm on a mission to tell you the truth, to tell you the things your pastor won't tell you, so that you then have all the information and you can make your own informed decision. That's it at the end of the day. Information, knowledge is power, is why we're here at the University of West Indies, Cave Hill. And I think for some Black people, there is a sense that I have to just accept the religion that's presented to me. You don't question the Bible, you don't question God, you don't question the pastor, the rector. That's not true. God is big enough for your questions, so ask.
There's a question to you, but then I want to do something else. But there's a question to you, the one that I came in and I heard you say that it's I don't remember the exact word, but it's a problem to be told to close your legs. Why is it a problem?
No, I just think about it in ways of policing, children's sexualities. Okay, so boys don't have the same messaging as girls. The boy can sit down and his legs are sprawled, and everyone will pass him up and down, and no one will think to tell him that he needs to make sure that his legs are crossed or anything like that. Let a girl do that. Or somebody may tell her, oh, your panty is showing, so you have to sit properly, or you have to put on a tights. So I find even in my experiences at secondary school as a teacher, there were some expectations that girls wear their uniforms like 3 inches below the knees, right? And if their uniforms are too short, teachers would actually go to pick the hem down, So thinking about the ways in which we constantly are policing our girls into these right modes of behavior. And again, it comes from these colonial ideologies of gender, this prioritizing of the white construct of the woman. Again, going back to what I was saying about being very mindful and very demure and having propriety. And the ways in which we want our Black girls to kind of self-fashion against these colonial standards, even though it doesn't always play out in reality. So Erna Robert talks about, mass media images of the genteel woman, right? So you would have images of the queen, and she's walking in the gardens with her family, with the children and the dogs and the cats, right? And those were the images that were marketed to us within the Caribbean. So those are the ideologies.
right? Even when we go back to the text that we were talking about with Sherry Jones, Say Josie, there's another text by Toni Morrison that starts in a very similar way. See the house.
The bluest eye.
See the mother, see the father, see the two children, and see the cat, see the dog, right? So this perfect picture of a nuclear heteronormative family. So the ways in which women and girls become subsumed into these particular roles as a result. But Erna Barbara also talks about the ways in which sometimes the stereotype doesn't often embody the actor. And by that she means that sometimes these are the ideologies, but in reality people are living their lives regardless of these notions of gender and race and class that have been persistent and prescribed for them.
Okay, I wanted to have you clarify that, because it's not always a problem. Khalil Gibran has in The Prophet, one of the statements, I can't remember who it's to, but he talks about in this world, in this time, things are really bad, and therefore you have to do a certain amount of security in this time because things are really bad in this time. So you cannot have the perfect expression of yourself now. You have to be working with what you have. So I don't know if
But doesn't that implicate the sexist ideologies that are in operation?
I'm not going to talk about things, big words like ideology and things like that. I have a difficulty with stuff like that now. Right? What I believe is that we are living a life and we're not even aware of what it is. I was telling somebody today, when I speak, right, I'm using wind, the muscles of my jaw, the muscles in my tongue, and you are hearing tongue. That is a miracle. And we act like if it's ordinary and it's normal and it's everyday. So I think that anyhow, I'm getting a little confused here. I'm a poet. What I wanted to do to the sister is offer you a song. It's not long. Can I do that?
Do we have time?
Go ahead.
Greg Porter.
We have one more question tonight.
Greg Porter. They gild their houses in preparation for the king. They line the sidewalks with every sort of shiny thing. They will be surprised when they hear him say, "Welcome to the alley. Welcome to the afflicted ones." I'm singing it wrong. The lonely ones, the ones that lost their way. Let them hear me say, I am your friend. Welcome to my garden. Sit here at my table. You will find a pardon. You will find a pardon. Just today, I updated my status with James in the Bible, and I like the King James Version. It's the one I grew up with as a Pentecostal. James chapter 1, verse 27, and it says, pure religion is this. Pure religion is this. Look after the orphans and the widows in their distress, and keep yourself from being tainted by the world. And that's pure religion, written in the King James Version that I was taught subsequent to going to Pentecostal church to hate. And that's what it says. So I just wanted to offer that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
So hi, my name's Alexis.
Hi.
I just wanted to share that I literally found your book this morning. Something popped up on Instagram, and I was like, oh, I've never seen this before, let me go and see. So as a psychotherapist, I just wondered, I'll try to keep this succinct. Do you feel like this book goes alongside like a psychotherapy journey? Is it something you would recommend? Because I'm just thinking there's a lot of women that I work with who've experienced trauma, who completely, you spoke about, body keeps the score, etc. And I'm just thinking there are so many women, black women specifically, that I work with that experience trauma, and most of our work, months, sometimes even years of our initial work is very much just accessing the body again.
Yes.
And I'm just thinking about all the things that you've spoken about already today. Can't wait to read it. But I'm just wondering, how do you think this text goes alongside a psychotherapy journey for women who've experienced, black women, let's say, who've experienced trauma?
Thank you for your question. So my therapist, Dr. Brianna Boyd, who's a biracial black woman, wrote the foreword to my book because I was quoting her so much in the text. I was like, girl, can you just come write this forward, because I need the people to meet the person that I'm quoting so much. Because ultimately, talk therapy wasn't demonic or a force that went against my faith. It was simply another tool, another point of access to have someone who is trained, formally trained, to sit with me and help me figure out why I am the way I am and how can I become the best version of myself, which ultimately religion is supposed to do. But in the toxic, patriarchal, colonized West, outside of, I don't want to say your experience is an outlier, but outside of very special, right, matriarchal, matrilineal expressions where women are welcomed into leadership in major religions, where queer people are welcomed, where trans people are welcomed. The fact of the matter is you cannot say that religion is serving society when half of or more of the population is not granted access to lead in that facet of society. So it's important for us to honor that religion is always in the room, to quote religion news reporter Liz Konecki, and it's a personal story, but it has very real implications, because what's going on in the United States, people really think that they are leading with their religious beliefs. They really think that controlling women's bodies, that forcing births, that removing abortion care is a sign from God. And I'm like, who's God? Because what are we doing here? Anything that comes from a place of control and domination is not a helpful tool for our society. And for me, talk therapy has been a helpful tool. I don't think it's the end all be all. I do think community care is important. I do think somatic therapy, moving our bodies, is important. I do think that intergenerational conversations and healing and wholeness and wellness all contribute to the conversation. But ultimately, I want to see us remove ourselves from the weight of colonized religion, because it's then we will able to be free and to move and have autonomy from young girls and boys up until our elders. And so at the end of the day, I want to see a world where Black girls and women and femmes are free and safe and soft, and Black boys and men and non-gender conforming folks too. So Sensual Faith is a part of that path, and I'm very honored to share this work with y'all.
That's beautiful. And just before we end, I have one more question for you. You know how we in Barbados would say looking at the road?
Yes.
At the road because they get him lately. Right? So if somebody has to leave this conversation curious about, but also unsure at the same time as to where to begin, what is one small step that they could take towards coming home to their body?
So I often talk about self-love as it pertains to mirror work. When we see our reflection, it's often very fast. We're checking to make sure our hair is in place, we're prim and proper, ready to go to work or school. But the next time you're in the mirror, I want you to linger a little bit. I want you to really look at yourself. And it might be awkward to make eye contact with yourself, but just laugh at it, right? Like, self, this is awkward, but I'm gonna do it because Lyvonne told me to, right? And see it as an exercise in honoring your divinity, in seeing your reflection, and really being seen, not as a Black person, not as a student, not as a lecturer, but just as an expression of the divine. And if you feel like you can do that, I feel like the next step is to go ahead and say some affirmations to yourself. Tell yourself how much you love yourself. Tell yourself how worthy you are. Tell yourself the things you're scared to say out loud, the dreams that you have. And then, because it is sensual faith, if you're feeling really frisky, go ahead and dance in the mirror. Bonus points if you do it naked, okay? Because there's something about seeing the fullness of who you are, not unencumbered, right? Not hindered by clothing, and to know that there's no part of you that is bad or unholy or that needs to be pushed away. And so I think mirror work is sorcery, and I use that word very intentionally. I think that we deserve to be seen as Black people in a world that tries to invisibilize us, that tries to minimize us, dehumanize us, demonize us. Divinify yourself in the mirror.
Such a beautiful way to end. And Lyvonne, I think this was a wonderful conversation, so brilliant and generative. I think we can all agree that we've learned so much about, our faith, our sensuality, our sexuality, the politics of the world. And we have so many insights that we can go home and apply, as I said, in the mirror. So I just wanted to take a moment as well to big up my students and
Big up on yourself.
even some colleagues from overseas conferences who came out to support tonight. Thank you guys so much for coming. People across the faculties of culture, the IGDS staff, I want to thank all of you for supporting. And for those who came in late, I just wanted to remind you of who Lyvonne is. So I'm just going to read her bio quickly. So Lyvonne Briggs is an Emmy Award winner, and she's a body and sex positive womanist preacher, speaker, coach, and creator. Briggs is the host of the Sensual Faith podcast and the founder of Beautiful Scars, a healing center storytelling agency focused on fostering pleasure and resiliency, visionary of the proverbial experience, and curator of Sensual Faith Sunday, a series of virtual spiritual gatherings to nourish your soul. She has been featured in Essence, Cosmopolitan, Rolling Stone, and the Washington Post, and Sojourners named her one of 11 women shaping the church. A New York City native and proud member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, Lyvonne Briggs is currently based in New Orleans, Louisiana, and she holds a master in theology, practical theology from Columbia Seminary, and a master's in divinity from the Christian Social Womanist Ethics from Yale Divinity School. So I just want you all to join me as we, move our separate ways from the veranda, from this conversation, from producing knowledge, and give a round of applause for Lyvonne. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for everyone for coming. Thank you for supporting the IGDS events. I just want to remind you, we have another event on Friday. So we're moving from a veranda chat to some veranda performances. So we're going to be having Cindy Silatis, who's going to perform with us on Friday at our night market. So I encourage all of you to come out on Friday night to our night market. Yep. There will be some women entrepreneurs. So please, Friday night, all are welcome once in all. So we have some refreshments for you. So, and also, Ms. Lyvonne Briggs, she's here. She's going to sign some books, and books are also here for purchase. Thank you very much. Thank you all.
Okay.